Normandy. Late July 1944. The hedgerows here are older than the country the Americans came from. Earth walls, waist-thick with root, grown over centuries into something no engineer ever designed a machine to break. A man can stand in one field and have no idea that the next field holds a gun. Inside the turret of a Sherman tank, near the front of an armored column, there is a man who does not belong there. He is not a tanker. He has never loaded a 75mm round. He does not know this machine the way the others know it, does not know the smell of it, the corded, and the hot oil and the sweat of 5 men, sealed inside a steel box in a French summer. He is wearing a tanker's padded helmet, and it does not sit right on his head because it was not made for him. He is a fighter pilot. 2 weeks ago, he was 7,000 feet above this same ground, in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, looking down at Normandy the way you look at a map. Now inside the map, and in his hand is a microphone wired to a radio that does not belong in a tank either, an aircraft set, very high frequency, the same equipment carried by the aircraft, circling somewhere above the cloud layer, out of sight waiting. Ahead, the column stops. Word comes back down the line the way it always does, tank to tank, voice to voice. Something in the tree line, something dug in, something that has already killed. The pilot in the turret keys the microphone. He does not describe the target the way a soldier would describe it. He describes it the way a man in a cockpit needs to hear it described. The shape of the field, the angle of approach, the line of the hedge. He describes it that way because he has been in that cockpit, because 2 weeks ago he was the one looking down, and that is the entire reason he is sitting in a tank today. 3 minutes, that is the number. From the moment his voice leaves that turret to the moment the sky answers. The thunderbolts come down out of the cloud with 850 caliber machine guns each, and the sound arrives before the aircraft do, and whatever was waiting in that tree line stops being a problem. The column moves. Between 10 and 14 tanks in every American armored division carried a radio like that one. Not every tank, not most tanks. A handful in each division, picked and modified. But it was enough to change what an armored column was. Somebody's boy from Ohio was driving that tank. Somebody's boy from Texas was flying the airplane above it. Neither one of them knew the other man's name. They were about to save each other's lives anyway. And on the other side of that tree line, German soldiers were listening. That is the part almost nobody else yells you. They heard it. They heard the American voices. They heard them for months, clear as a church bell. And there was nothing on this earth that they could do about it. This is the story of why. 5 years later, in an American detention facility, a German's general is sitting in front of a stack of blank paper. His name is Albert Braun. He is a signals officer, and he has been one since 1913, since he entered the Bavarian Telegraph Battalion as an officer candidate, back when the wire was the war and the radio was a curiosity. He survived the first war, survived the second. In the final autumn of the Reich, they made him chief of the German Army's signal communications, which is a magnificent title for a man handed the wreckage of a nervous system that had already stopped responding. And now the United States Army has asked him to write something. Not a confession, not a testimony, a report for the Army's own historians. Just to explain in his own hand how German radio intelligence worked, how it listened, what it heard, what it did with what it heard. So the winners hand a stack of paper to the loser, and they ask him to explain himself. And what he writes will end up in an American archive, and it will still be sitting there 70 years later, and almost nobody will ever read it. Braun writes. And the picture that comes out of those pages is the picture in the movies. He described an enormous listening machine. Toward the end of the war, roughly 12,000 German signal troops were doing nothing else. Nothing but intercepting the radio traffic of an enemy who was growing stronger every month. Direction-finding sets. Traffic analysis. Men in headphones, hour after hour after hour, pulling American voices out of the air over France and Belgium, and finally out of the air over Germany itself. He does not write that the Germans were deaf. He writes something far worse. He writes as it they'd hear. To understand what they were hearing, you have to go back. Not to Normandy, not to the tanks at all. Back to a low brick laboratory on the New Jersey shore, six years before that pilot ever climbed into a turret. Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, 1938. The director of the Signal Corps Laboratories is a colonel named Roger Colton. He is an engineer, not an orator. There is no famous photograph of him. There is no speech anyone quotes. He is the kind of officer that history walks straight past because he did his work in memoranda and specifications and procurement orders, and none of that ever makes a good scene. And in 1938, Roger Colton makes a decision. He decides that every future radio the United States Army buys will use frequency modulation. Not some of them. Not the experimental ones. Not a pilot program in a corner of a laboratory. All of them. Understand what that sentence means in 1938. The entire American radio industry runs on amplitude modulation. Every broadcast station in the country, every set in every living room, every military radio the Army currently owns, and every spare part for it, and every man trained to fix it. The factories are tooled for it. The patents are built on it. Careers, fortunes, whole corporations rest on it. And a colonel at a laboratory in New Jersey has just decided that the United States Army is walking away from all of it. Years later, in a letter, the man who invented the alternative would call that the most difficult decision in the history of radio that anyone was ever called upon to make. He was not being gracious. He was being accurate. Here is why it mattered. Take an amplitude modulation radio, a good one, the best your country can build, and put it inside a tank. Not a laboratory, not a truck on a road, a tank. Now start the engine. Every spark plug that fires is a small burst of electromagnetic noise. The dynas motor spinning behind the crew is noise. The generator is noise. The steel chills tracks grinding and slapping over the return rollers, throwing off static with every meter are noise. The vehicle is, in the most literal sense, a machine for manufacturing interference, and it is sitting 3 feet from the receiver. An amplitude modulation circuit sees its meaning in the strength of the wave, in its amplitude. And electrical noise is also a change in strength, which means the radio cannot tell the difference between the message and the machine it is bolted inside. So a tank commander presses the headphones hard against his ears, and he hears a storm. And somewhere far down inside that storm, if he is lucky, a human voice arriving in fragments. The Germans knew this. Of course they knew it. They had good engineers and they had good radios and they were not fools. They had simply chosen amplitude modulation, and so, when a panzer started moving, its voice began to drown. Frequency modulation carries the meaning somewhere else entirely. Not in how strong the wave is, in how fast it changes. Noise cannot reach it there. Noise can scream at a frequency modulate receiver all day long, and the receiver will not care. The man who proved that was Edwin Howard Armstrong. He was a professor at Columbia. He had served in the Signal Corps in the First World War in France, and beginning in 1934, he filed a series of patents on wideband frequency modulation, and then he spent years demonstrating again and again in front of men who did not want to see it, that the static could be made to vanish. The static was not supposed to vanish. The static was a law of nature. Everyone in radio knew that. It was the one thing everyone knew. Armstrong had a friend named David Sarnoff. Sarnoff ran RCA. Sarnoff ran NBC Scene. Sarnoff had built an empire, and the foundation stone of the empire was amplitude modulation broadcasting, and the two men had known each other for years. Armstrong had been running his experiments from a tower on top of the Empire State Building. Sarnoff shut him out of it. So in 1937, Edwin Armstrong crossed the Hudson River to Alpine, New Jersey, and he's built his own tower. He put it on the Palisades, on the cliffs above the water, its mast standing some 700 feet above the river, staring straight back across at Manhattan. He paid for it out of his own pocket. It is still standing there today. That is what it cost. A man had to build a tower out of spite to prove that the future worked, and the Army came to him. There was a young engineer at Fort Monmouth in that period, assigned to the section developing radios for vehicles and tanks. And years afterward, he remembered it very simply. He said that Armstrong was a frequent visitor to the laboratory, and he said that the result of that work was that the War Department's orders for amplitude modulation equipment were changed. They were changed to frequency modulations instead. That is the entire revolution in one plain sentence, from man who was in the room while it happened. On the 22nd of July, 1941, the United States Army standardized a family of radio sets, the SCR-508, the SCR-538, the SCR-538. They were based on designs from the Link Radio Corporation, a firm that had been putting frequency modulation sets into American police cars. They were engineered for the Signal Corps by Bell Laboratories and Western Electric, and by March of 1942 they were going to war. Frequency modulation, crystal-controlled. 10 channels, and you selected them with your thumb. Press a button. You are on the net. The turret bustle of the Sherman tank, that armored box hanging off the back of the turret, was shaped around that radio. Think about that for a moment. The tank was designed to fit the radio. Now hold the two facts side by side and look at what they actually mean. The single most important technology the American Army carried into the Second World War was a technology that the American radio industry had spent a decade trying to strangle in its cradle. It did not survive because it was obvious. It did not survive because the market wanted it, or because it was fashionable, or because powerful scenes changed it. It survived because one colonel in one laboratory in 1938 signed his name to a piece of paper. And the man who made it possible did something else. When the war came, Edwin Howard Armstrong gave the War Department free use of his patents. He did not charge the United States government 1 cent for the invention that would ride into battle inside tens of thousands of American tanks and half-tracks and jeeps and gun carriages. He simply handed it over. Every American tank crew who ever heard a clear human voice cut through the roar of a running engine owed something to that gift, and almost none of them ever knew his name. Armstrong would spend the rest of his life in courtrooms, fighting to be recognized as the man who gave it away, and it would kill him. There is a story that tells itself about that war. It is a good story, and most of it is true. But the version you were handed is missing something. The missing piece is the part that matters most. Here is what people believe. They believe the Germans fought that war half-blind. They believe the panzers rolled forward with flags and hand signals and shouted orders, while the Americans, clever and modern and industrial, sat inside their Shermans with a radio in every turret, talking to one another like men on a telephone. It is a comfortable story. It flatters us. Some of you were raised on it. Some of you had a father or an uncle who came home from that war and never said a word about it, and this is the stories that filled the silence. Put the two machines on a table, side by side. Open them up and look at what is actually inside. The American set is the SCR-508 and its two cousins, the 528 and the 538. 181 pounds of steel and glass and copper bolted into the bustle at the back of the Sherman's. Inside it, a BC-604 transmitter, 25 watts, frequency modulation, 20 to 27.9 megahertz, 10 channels, each one held in place by a slab of quartz crystal, each one set by pressing a button with your thumb, 2 receivers stacked beside it, so a commander could listen to 2 net hits at once. And built into that box, the intercom, so that 5 men buttoned-eyed, a roaring steel hull could speak to each other without screaming themselves raw. The turret of the Sherman was shaped around that radio. Think about that. They designed the tank to fit the box. And now let me tell you something the flattering version leaves out. Not every Sherman got the full set. There was a third radio in that family, the SCR-538. And then the SCR-538 had no transmitter in it at all. It could listen, it could not speak. When the factories ran short, or when a battalion ran short, that is what went into the tank. So before you laugh at the German crew who could only hear his orders and never answer them, Understand this. There were American crews in that same positions, seen in that same summer in tanks built in Detroit. The gap between those two armies was real. It was decisive, but it was never as clean as you were told. Now, the Germans set the Fu-5, a 10-watt transmitter and an ultra-shortwave receiver wired together there, sitting in the hull beside the radio operator. 27 to 33.3 megahertz, 125 channels, spaced 50 kilohertz apart. Amplitude modulation, voice range on a good day, with the tank standing still and the engine quiet, 2 to 3 kilometers. Look at those numbers again. 25 watts against 10. Frequency modulation against amplitude modulation. Quartz crystals against a tuning dial that ripped every time Tal hole took a shock. That is the gap. That is the whole gap, and it is real, and it is decisive. And I am going to spend the rest of this hour showing you exactly what it meant. But first, notice what is not on that table. There is a radio in the German tank. There is a radio in almost every German tank. In the early years, in Poland and in France, that was not yet true. Many of the little Panzer Is and Panzer Is carried a receiver only. They could hear an order and never answer it. But by the time the Americans reached Europe, that had changed. By 1943, a transmitter and a receiver sat in the hull of the Panzer IV, in the hull of the Panther, in the Tiger, in the assault guns. German crews could talk. They talked constantly. They talked to each other and to their company commander and to the guns behind them. The idea that the Germans did not have radios in their tanks is not a small error. It is the exact opposite of the truth, because here is the thing that ought to stop you cold. The doctrine of putting a radio inside every single gold tank was not an American idea. It was a Zerg. One. His name was Heinz Guderian, and long before Normandy, long before Pearl Harbor, long before there was a Sherman on any drawing board anywhere in the state of Michigan, he had already worked it out. Guderian came up through signals. That is the detail everybody forgets. Before he was the architect of the Blitzkrieg, before he's the man whose panzers cut France in half in 6 weeks, he was a communications officer. He spent the First World War thinking about how information moves and how it fails to move and how armies die when it stops moving. So when he finally turned his mind to tanks, he did not think first about armor thickness. He did not think first about gun caliber. He thought about the voice. In 1937, he published a book, Achtung Panzer. And the argument at the heart of it was not really about tanks at all. It was about coordination. It was the idea that a mass of armored vehicles moving at speed is worthless, worse than worthless, unless every one of them can be told, right now, this instant, where to go and what to kill. Not with signal flags, not with a dispatched rider on a motorcycle who would be dead in a ditch before he ever arrived. With a huge voice, in seaheads, in every vehicle. The Germans built their army around that idea, and in the spring of 1940, in the forests of the Ardennes and on the roads running to the Channel, they proved it. The French army had more tanks. In many cases, the French had better tanks, with thicker armor and heavier guns, and the French army came apart like wet paper in 6 because too many French tanks could not talk. Some had no radio at all. And the ones that did had a commander who was also his own gunner and his own loader, standing alone in a one-man turret, trying to fight the tank and hear the war at the same time. By the time an order reached him, the war had already moved somewhere else. So understand exactly what happened here. The Americans did not outthink the Germans on this. The Americans took a German idea and built it better, and that is a far more uncomfortable story and a far more interesting one. Because it means the gap between those two tanks was never a gap in imagination. It was never a gap in doctrine. Both sides knew precisely what a radio was for. Both sides had bet their armored forces on it. The gap was a gap in physics. It came down to a single word, modulation. It came again to a choice made in a laboratory in New Jersey and a different choice made in a laboratory in Germany. And one of those choices was right and the other one was wrong. And neither side would fully understand what that meant until men were burning inside their vehicles because of it. The Germans were not blind. They were never blind. They were fighting in the noise. And if you think for 1 second that the better radio was enough on its own to win a battle, then let me take you to Tunisia. Because I have to show you the day it failed. February 1943. The Americans have been in North Africa for 3 months. They came ashore in November, green as spring grass, and they have not yet met the German army in earnest. The men in those tanks are both from Illinois and Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Farm boys, mill boys. Most of them have never been shot at by anybody, and the radios worked. Every one of them. The crystals held, the channels held. The voices came through clean. On paper, they are the best connected armored force on the continent of Africa. And between the 14th and the 24th of February 1943, at a gap in the western dorsal mountains called the Kasserine Pass, they are taken apart. Not outfought. Taken apart. The Germans come through the passes, and the American line does not bend. It disintegrates. Positions are held by men who have no idea where the unit on their flank has gone. Tank companies are fed into the fight, one at a time, piecemeal, into ground nobody has scouted, against anti-tank guns nobody has located. Orders are issued, then countermanded, then contradicted an hour later, by a different headquarters that does not know the first order was ever given. Units fall back and nobody tells the units beside them. Those men wake in the dark to find the enemy behind them. Equipment is abandoned in the passes. Vehicles left running, whole positions given up. Men walk west out of the mountains carrying nothing, and the roads fill with them. And the American army in North Africa comes closer to breaking than it ever would again. Thousands of casualties, hundreds of vehicles gone. Even backpack that had taken weeks to win. And every single one of those tanks had a working frequency modulation radio bolted into the turret. Sit with that for a minute. Do not move past it. The technology worked. It worked perfectly. Every quartz crystal held its frequency. Every push button selected its channel. Every voice came through clean and sharp through the ignition noise, exactly the way Edwin Armstrong had promised in a laboratory 5 years earlier, and half a world away. And it did not matter, because a radio does not tell you what to say. You can give a man the finest communication system on the face of the earth, and if he does not know what is happening, all you have done is allow him to broadcast his confusion at 25 watts. You can connect a battalion perfectly and instantly to a headquarters that has no idea what it wants. You can transmit a bad order faster than any army in the history of warfare has ever transmitted a bad order. That is what Kasserine was. That is exactly what Kasserine was. The American army was not beaten there by German radios. It was beaten by inexperience, by green crews, by commanders who did not yet know how to fight and could not yet admit it, by an entire army that had been handed the tools of a modern war and had not yet learned the trade. And the Germans, fighting inside the noise, with 10 watts and amplitude modulation, and a tuning dial that drifted every time a shell landed nearby, beat them anyway. So let us kill the myth right here, right now, halfway through, before it goes one step further. The Sherman's radio did not win the war. It never won a single battle by itself. Not one. It was not a magic box. It was not a secret weapon. It was a piece of equipment. And equipment is worth exactly as much as the men using it. And in February of 1943, the men were not ready. What changed after Kasserine was not the hardware. The hardware was already there, in every tank. What changed was everything else. Commanders were relieved. Careers ended in a week. Training was torn down to the studs and built. An army learned, in the worst way an army can learn, what it had not known. And only then, only after that education was paid for in blood in the mountains of Tunisia, only then did the radio begin to become what it was capable of becoming. Hold on to that, because in a little while I am going to show you the thing it did become, and it is not what you expect, and it is not in the tank. Now, while that was happening, while American boys were dying in the Tunisian passes, Edwin Howard Armstrong was fighting a different war. He was in his 50s. He was not in uniform. He was in courtrooms. And back in the factories, there was a crisis almost nobody has ever heard of. and it very nearly strangled the entire program in its cradle. Quartz. Every one of those 10 push-button channels in the SCR-508 depended on a crystal. A precisely cut, ground slab of quartz, vibrating at one frequency and no other, holding that radio rock steady while the tank pitched and hammered across broken ground. That crystal is what made the push button possible. That crystal is what let an entire battalion come up on the same net in seconds, instead of every commander hunting blindly across the dial while the shells came in. But quartz of that quality does not come out of the ground in New Jersey. It came from Brazil, in the holds of ships, across an ocean patrolled by submarines. Every crate of it was a gamble against a torpedo, and once it landed, it had to be inspected, cut, ground, and tested to tolerances that had barely existed a few years earlier by workers who had never done it before, in factories that had been making something else entirely a year ago, and the Army needed them by the million. Millions of crystals, for 100,000 radios, for a war on two sides of the world at once. Armstrong knew exactly what he had asked of them. In a letter he wrote to Roger Colton in June of 1944, right in the middle of the Normandy campaign, with the guns still firing in France, he looked back on those early years and admitted something a proud man does not easily admit. He said that only the very small number of people who had understood frequency modulation in those days could have any conception of the size of the problem the Signal Corps had been handed. He said the demands had seemed impossible to fulfill. 100 separate channels.
Pushed selection between each chosen button.
Frequency stability held to the most severe tolerances. And not enough quartz. That is not a boast. That is a confession. Is the inventor Essie himself at the height of his vindication, with Rodriguez riding into battle in 50,000 tanks, admitting on paper that what he had asked hell's country tooth had been, by any reasonable measure, undoable. They did it anyway. And now here is the part that is going to sit in your chest for the rest of this hour. While men in American factories were grinding Brazilian quartz, and while men in Tunisia were burning to death inside their tanks, Edwin Armstrong owned the patents that made all of it possible. He had already given it away. You know that. He handed the patents to the War Department for nothing, and every radio in every tank in Tunisia was riding on his life's work, and he would not see a dollar of it. What he had not counted on was what the giving would cost him. Because on the other side of that same city, in those same years, David Sarnoff's lawyers were bleeding him white. That is what he was doing while the war was on. Litigation, year after year after year, deposition after deposition, over the question of who had really invented frequency modulation. A question with an answer so obvious that it should never have required a courtroom, let alone 20 years of them. He gave it away to his country for free, and he spent his entire fortune fighting for the right to be called its father. He was still fighting when the war ended. He was still fighting years after that. He would never stop. Now come back to France. Come back to the summer of '44 and the hedgerows and the moment the miracle broke wide open. Normandy. June and July 1944. The bocage. The hedgerows are not hedges. Get that word out of your head. They are earthen ramparts, centuries old, packed solid with root, crowned with thorn and tree, and they cut the whole of that country into little boxes 100 meters across. In some of those fields, the visibility is nothing at all. A German infantryman can lie flat in the base of a hedge 8 meters from a Sherman, and the crew inside that tank will never, ever see him. He is carrying a Panzerfaust, a tube, a shaped charge on a stick. It costs almost nothing to make. Any boy can fire it, and by that summer, they were sending boys. It will burn a hole clean through the flank of a Sherman and turn the inside of that tank into a furnace with 5 men still in it. And here is the terrible thing. The American infantry are right there. They are walking beside the tank, 10 feet away, sometimes closer than that, using the hull for cover. They can see the German. They can see him shift in the hedge. They know in that half second that the tank is about to die, and they cannot tell the crew. Because the Sherman's radio, the finest tank radio in the world, transmits between 20 and 27.9 megahertz, and the infantryman's radio, the SCR 300 riding on a rifleman's back, transmits between 40 and 48 megahertz. Different bands, different worlds. The tank cannot hear the infantry, and the infantry cannot hear the tank, and they are standing close enough to reach out and touch one another. The most advanced tank radio ever built, and it had made the Sherman deaf to the only men on that field who could save its life. It is all in the after-action reports. All of it, written down in the flat, dry language of men who watched it happen. The infantry cannot warn the tanks in time. The infantry, taking fire, fall back away from the tanks, and the tanks, buttoned up and blind in a green tunnel with almost no field of view, are left alone in the hedgerows, which is precisely, exactly where a man with a tube on his shoulder wants them. They tried everything. They tried passing the infantry's handy-talkie up into the tank. The vehicle's own electrical system howled all over it. The engines ate the signal alive, useless. They tried mounting spare tank radios on wooden backboards and handing them to infantry company headquarters. Those sets weighed 135 pounds. No man alive is carrying that through a hedgerow under fire, and there were never enough of them anyway. And in the end, the solution did not come from Bell Laboratories. It did not come from Fort Monmouth. It did not come from Edwin Armstrong or Roger Colton or any laboratory anywhere in the United States of America. It came from a welder, somebody in a maintenance company, standing in a muddy field in France with a torch in his hand, took an empty ammunition box. He welded it to the back plate of a Sherman tank. He put an E8 field telephone inside it and T-Sync swire swaps straight into the tank's intercom. A field telephone, a crank telephone, a copper wire. Now a rifleman could sprint up behind the tank, into its shadow, into cover, flip open that box, pick up the handset, and speak directly into the ears of the commander sitting 3 feet away on the other side of the steel. That was it. That was the fix. The finest radio system in the world, saved by a piece of 19th century technology, bolted to the back of a tank with a welding torch. No single name survives for it. It was not invented in one place. It was invented in a dozen muddy fields at once, by men who needed it and could not wait for anybody's permission. And it worked. It spread through the armored divisions the way things spread in an army at war, by word of mouth and welding rod, one battalion telling the next. And by the end of that summer, it was everywhere. And it saved men. It saved a great many men. So hold both of these truths in your hands at once, because both of them are true, and neither one cancels the other. The Americans had built something the Germans could not match. And it had a hole in it so wide that a 17-year-old boy with a metal tube could walk straight through it. That is the war. That is what it actually looked like. Not a clean line from invention to victory. A brilliant machine with a fatal flaw patched in a field by a welder, while the man who invented it sat in a courtroom in New York, losing everything he had. Which leaves us with only one question. If the Sherman's radio could not save the Americans at Kasserine, and if it could not even talk to the infantryman standing 3 feet away in a hedgerow, then what, in God's name, was it actually for? What did it do that mattered? The answer is not in the tank. The answer was never in the tank. The answer is at the other end of the line. And when I show you what was waiting there, you are going to understand why 12,000 German soldiers with headphones on could hear every word the Americans said and still lose. July 1944, Normandy. There is a man walking around the headquarters of the 9th Air Force who does not behave like a general. His name is Elwood Quesada. Everybody calls him Pete. He is 40 years old, which in that war, at that rank, is very nearly a boy. He commands the 9th Tactical Air Command, more than 1,000 aircraft and the men who fly them. And he still gets into a cockpit himself and goes looking for trouble over France, which is not a thing generals are supposed to do. And Quesada has an idea that nobody has asked him for. The plans for the breakout are coming together. Operation Cobra. And Quesada looks at the problem and sees it plainly. When those armored columns finally punch through and start running, they will outrun their own artillery within hours. And the fighters overhead will be circling above a column they cannot talk to, hunting targets they cannot see, guessing. So he proposes this. Take an aircraft radio. A VHF set, the same kind the pilots use, bolted into a tank. Put an air support party right there in the armored column and let the tanks talk directly to the airplanes. Omar Bradley says yes, and then the United States Army almost loses the war to its own paperwork. Ordnance is told to send one Sherman to 9th Tactical Air Command for a trial installation, one tank. It never arrives. Somewhere between the depot and the airfield, that Sherman is dispatched to an armored division instead. And the division does exactly what a division in the middle of a campaign does with a spare tank that appears out of nowhere. It swallows it, absorbs it. The tank is gone, so they send a second one. And this one actually arrives at 9th TAC headquarters, and nobody there knows what to do with it. Picture it. A 30-ton Sherman tank parked on an airfield surrounded by pilots, and not one man on that field has any idea why it is there. So they send it back. With thanks, they return the tank to Ordnance with their compliments. Higher command, when it finds out, is not amused. The tank is hunted down, retrieved, and dragged back, and this time somebody installs the radio. That is how it happened. The single most important tactical innovation of the Normandy campaign came within one clerical error of never existing at all. By the time Cobra opens, between 10 and 14 tanks in every armored division are carrying that aircraft radio. And Casata does one more thing, and this is the part that makes him different from every other general in that theater. He puts pilots in the tanks. Fighter bomber pilots. Men who have spent a year looking at France from 7,000 feet. He reasons that a pilot on the ground will be able to describe a target to a pilot in the air better than any soldier ever could. He knows what a target looks like from up there. The British had done something like it in the desert. The Americans had tried it in Italy, at Salerno. But nobody had ever put the man inside the armor, at the point of the spear, riding forward with the tanks he was protecting. Forward air control. The thing that would become standard practice in Korea and in Vietnam and in every American war since. He grew up in a hedgerow in Normandy in July of 1944 because one man refused to accept that the sky and the ground could not speak to each other. The 25th of July, 1944, Operation Cobra. The bombers come first, and the ground west of Saint-Lô is torn open, and then the armor goes through. And above the column come the thunderbolts. They came in flights of 4 and 8, circling over the lead elements, and they did not leave. That was the discipline of it. A flight would orbit above the point of the spear, and it would not go home until the relieving flight arrived overhead. There was always somebody up there. Always. The call signs went into the pilot's vocabulary like the names of old friends. The 2nd Division was Abatid. Its combat commands were Cutbreak and Murphy. The 3rd Armored Division was Instand, and its fighting units were Poodle and Bronco. Poodle, Bronco. Grown men in flying helmets, calling down death, using words like that. On the very first day of armored column cover, 4 fighter groups flew 72 squadron missions of that type. That rate held, and it held through the last week of July, and the pace of the American advance changed into something the Germans had no answer for. An obstacle that would have cost armored column hours, a dug-in gun, a roadblock, a tree line that had to be cleared by dismounted infantry, was now eliminated in minutes. 3 minutes, from the voice in the turret to the guns firing from the sky. On the other summer side of it, Fritz Bayerlein watched his division die. He was 40 years old. He had served under Rommel in the desert. He commanded Panzer Lehr, which had been, on paper, the best-equipped armored division in the German army. Fresh, fully stocked, the showpiece. Cobra broke it in a morning. Now stop. Because this is where the story usually becomes a lie, and I am not going to tell you the lie. You have heard it said that the fighter bombers destroyed the Panzers, that the P-47s hunted German tanks through the fields of Normandy and burned them where they stood. They did not. After the war, RAF ground teams walked the battlefields and examined the wrecks, and what they found was this. Very few German tanks had actually been knocked out from the air. It took a direct hit from a bomb or a rocket to kill a tank, and direct hits are rare, and pilots' claims were generous. What the aircraft actually killed was trucks, soft-skinned vehicles, fuel carriers, supply columns, horse-drawn wagons, because the German army in 1944 still ran on horses, and those burning trucks did something the bombs never could. They blocked the road. The Panzers, the Panthers, and the Tigers, the machines that no Sherman could face head-on, could not get past their own dead transport. They ran out of the fuel that was burning in the ditch behind them, and their crews climbed out and set them on fire and walked away. That is how the Germans' armored force died in Normandy. Not blown apart, abandoned, standing in the road with empty tanks, listening to engines they could not hear because the sky was full of aircraft they could not answer. So here is the truth, and it took me this whole hour to bring you to it. The weapon was never in the Sherman. The radio in that turret was not a weapon, it was a doorway. And on the other side of that doorway was the artillery and the sky. That was the thing the Germans could not match, not the box, what the box connected to. And now the hardest part. The Germans had an air-ground radio. They did. It was called the Fu-7. It sat in command tanks, and it was built to talk directly to the Luftwaffe. And it worked, and in the early years, it worked well. And by late 1944, they were pulling them out. They took the sets out of the command tanks and converted the vehicles to other roles. Not because the technology failed. The technology was fine. They took them out because there was nobody left to call. The Luftwaffe was gone from the skies over France. A German tank commander could key that microphone and shout into it until his voice broke and no one would come. Ever. So they ripped the radio out and used the space for something else. Read that again. The Germans did not lose the air-ground war because they lacked technology. They had the technology. They lost it because they had no air. They were not blind. They were not primitive. They were not stupid. They were alone. December 1944, the Ardennes. Now the Germans do something the Americans never see coming, and they do it by turning the radios off. No wireless traffic. Orders carried by hand, by telephone, by messengers on foot. Divisions moving at night under the trees, engines muffled, headlights out. For weeks, the greatest listening apparatus the Allies had ever built hears nothing at all from the Eiffel Forest because there is nothing to hear. And on the 16th of December, in fog and freezing rain, 250,000 German soldiers come out of those woods. Understand what has just happened. The Germans have beaten the American intelligence machine, and they have beaten it with silence. Every advantage we have been talking about for the last hour, every crystal, every watt, every clean channel, and none of it saw this coming. Green American divisions are overrun in the first days. Whole regiments are surrounded. Prisoners are marched into a field near Malmedy and machine-gunned in the snow. And the word of that runs down the American line faster than any radio could carry it. And something in the American hardens that week and does not soften again. But then the fighting starts. And the moment the fighting starts, the silence has to end. Because you cannot attack in silence. You can only arrive in silence. Go north to a low wooded ridge above the village of Elsenborn, the northern shoulder of the Bulge. This is where the Germans have the breakthrough, because this is the road to the Muses and to Antwerp, and to the war they think they can still win. They never take it, and what stops them is not the tanks. It is the guns is behind the tanks. American artillery battalions, wired together over the FM net, sharing the same air, hearing the same voices. An observer sees a German column forming in the trees, and he calls it in, and what answers is not one battery. It is every gun on range. Battalion after battalion, dropping steel on one map square at the same moment, arriving before the men on the ground can even get down into the snow. The German attacks come up that ridge, in the dark and in the fog, and they walk into a wall of fire that reassembles itself faster than they can maneuver, again and again and again. until the slope in front of Elsenborn is a place where nothing that stands up stays standing. The shoulder holds, the bulge turns, the road to Antwerp closes. And that is the whole answer. Right there, that is what the ratio in the Sherman was actually for. It was never about one tank talking to another tank. It was about a man in a turret being able to reach out and pull down the entire weight of the United States Army onto a single spot of earth in less time than it takes to boil water. The Germans could hear him do it. They could not do it back. The 7th of March, 1945, the Rhine. Men of the 90 armored visitors eyes above a poor Remagen and look down, and they can't believe what they are seeing. The Ludendorff Bridge is still standing. Every other bridge on that river is in the water. The Germans have blown them all, and here is one, intact, with German troops still crossing it, and demolition charges wired to its spans. The Rhine. Thy last great moat of Germany, the river that had not been crossed by a hostile army since Napoleon, and it is open. A lieutenant named Karl Timmerman is given the order to take it. He is 22 years old. He is from West Point, Nebraska, and his Vasalos Cameronton, Germany. The first American officer to set foot on the last bridge into Germany was the son of a German. He goes, his men go with him. They run onto the span with the demolition charges still live under their boots, and they cut wires with their hands. The Germans fire the charges. The bridge lifts and shudders and settles, and it holds. A sergeant named Alexander Drabik is the first man across. He does not stop running until he is standing on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Behind them, the report goes up the net. Not by runner, not by dispatch rider, by radio, from a company to a cabinet command, to a corps to an army. And it climbs that ladder in hours instead of days, and by nightfall General Hodges has poured everything he can reach into that bridgehead. And Eisenhower has approved it, and there are American soldiers standing inside Germany. The German response comes late, and it comes piecemeal, and it comes apart. Their telephone lines had been cut by aircraft. Their headquarters were talking to each other through a nervous system that had been severed in a dozen places. The Americans had a bridgehead in Germany because they could pass one sentence up a inch of command faster than the enemy could pass one sentence down. April 45. The Ruhr. 2 American armies close a ring around the industrial heart of Germany, and inside it it's over 300,000 German soldiers find that there is no longer an outside. Field Bean Marshal Walter Model commanded them. He had been called the Führer's fireman. He had saved hopeless situations on the Eastern Front more than once. He was 54 years old. He dissolved his army group rather than surrender it. He let the boys and the old men go home. And on the 21st of April, 1945, in a wood near Duisburg, Walter Model walked away from his staff and shot himself. The war in the West was over in 3 weeks, New York City. The 31st of January, 1954. An apartment on the 13th floor, River House, on the East River. Edwin Howard Armstrong is 63 years old. He has been in litigation for more than a decade. The lawsuits have eaten his fortune. They have eaten his marriage. Marion, his wife of 30 years, has left him. The man who gave his invention to his country for nothing has spent everything he had left trying to make the courts admit it was his. He dresses carefully, overcoat, hat, gloves, and he goes out the window. They found him on a 3rd floor. He never saw the end of it. He never heard a judge say the words. But Marion Armstrong did. She took up the fight. Her husband had died inside, and she carried it. And over the years that followed, she won. Case after case, she won them all. The vindication came. It came to a widow. And that report, the one the United States Army needed in order to understand its own victory in the war of the airwaves, the study of German radio intelligence that sits in the archives to this day. The Americans did not write it. They gave the paper to Albert Proun, a defeated German general in captivity, and sat down, explained to the winners what had actually happened to him. 12,000 German signalmen sitting in headphones, listening to American voices hour after hour, month after month, all the way from the hedgerows to the Rhine. They heard everything. They heard the call signs. Abtide, in stand, poodle, bronco. They heard the men in the turrets calling down the sky. And there was not one thing on God's earth they could do about it. The Germans were not in the dark. They heard us perfectly. That is the part that should frighten you.